sure my online students do as well, so might as well do that for everybody. Great. Alright. Do. Everything's up. Alright, we are, well, really more than halfway through this chapter, so we'll probably be finishing up chapter 5 today, and we'll move on to chapter 6 here in just a little bit. And again, once we finish chapter 6, that'll be the next test. So I'll go ahead and, if I don't think I put chapter 5 up on Blackboard yet. If I haven't, I'll do that today. And then we'll see how much we get through chapter 6 and do like we usually do. Study guide, etc., etc., and then we'll have the test. So, any questions before we start? Anybody? Okay. So, this is where we ended last time with the Townshend Act and the Boston Massacre. The Townshend Act with these various taxes on goods. The British response, which caused a bit of a ruckus in Boston, which resulted in 4 men being shot by British soldiers, which itself resulted in the Sons of Liberty turning this into anti-British propaganda, in which we now know it as the Boston Massacre. The British did back off. They repealed the Townshend Acts, or Townshend duties, I guess, on everything except tea, because they were still needing to make money from the colonies. And tea was something that most everybody partook in. So here again is the engraving printed by Paul Revere. Now, while there was this large rallying of support against the British specifically, it was not, and as you will see going forward in history, especially if you guys take my 103 and 104 courses, it's never cut and dry this side against the other side. Even as we get into the war, it's never 100% the colonists against 100% the British. And as we were rallying against British taxation, there were other colonists who were more concerned with their own local authorities. We've discussed the regulators in North Carolina. Governor Tryon said that Parliament had abused its power to collect taxes, but then he himself said that the regulators were traitors for refusing to pay taxes that he had levied on them, or at least had questioned his use of speculators, politicians, and employers to levy certain taxes. So a year after the Boston Massacre, so this is all happening around the same time. This wasn't something that happened like 20 years before. A year after the Boston Massacre, he sent his troops in to quell the regulators. They killed 20 men, injured 100, and hanged 6 leaders. So, yeah, this isn't like a watershed moment where all of the Americans are coming together to oppose the British. There's still a lot of internal conflict happening. So North Carolina was not the only colony to have issues with its local government, nor was the only colony to have regulators. We had our own branch of regulators down here in South Carolina. They emerged in 1767, and they basically took western portions of the colony, which again is like probably not even as far as where Columbia is today. Um, but western compared to say Charleston, um, and set up frontier justice. Basically had like with North Carolina and the Green Mountain Boys up in New York had, or not New York, Massachusetts, had their own like popular courts and laws and whatnot because the South Carolina Assembly were taxing them, but they weren't allowing them representation within the local court, within the local, and I guess it'd be, you call it parliament back then. Um, Nor were they using the taxes to like improve the towns out on the frontier. And when you're paying taxes, you expect the government to do something to help your community with said taxes. That's what your money's going into. You don't expect your money to be used to say, well, in the case of North Carolina, build the governor a new manor. That's not what your money is supposed to go into. Unlike in North Carolina, though, within 2 years, the South Carolina Assembly had negotiated a settlement with the regulators um, and extended greater representation to the settlements that they had basically taken under their wing. So the settlements were now more officially part of the South Carolina colony, no longer like under this weird frontier style government, but they also now had more representation on the South Carolina Assembly. So they got basically what the North Carolina regulators had wanted instead of getting shot like the North Carolina regulators got. So here we have regulators capturing a powder escort because you need gunpowder in order to shoot your gun. Okay, this was long before we had like cartridges that were all together, where bullets and whatnot were all in a single thing. And here we have appears to be regulators fighting redcoats, but I mean this could just as well be the North Carolina regulators fighting off Tryon's militia, because I mean technically state militia is going to be British troops, so it's just how that works. All right. And as I told my Tuesday Thursday class when we got to this one, this is like one of the most British headings for a PowerPoint I've ever made. T and widening resistance. That's British. Like, we're not talking about anywhere but Britain, or at least a British colony. So, to start out with, the British East India Company was given a monopoly over tea distribution in the colonies after May of 1773, which caused more issues. If you're not familiar with what the British East India Company is, think like all the biggest and far too powerful companies in the world today, but they're all the same company, and also they have their own military. So like, you know how Amazon's got way too much power, and like Disney has way too much power. Imagine they were combined, and also they had a military, like to the point that they could take over and rule a country the size of India, because that's what the British East India Company did. Like, they were sent to India to basically run trade there, and they ended up taking over most of India because, oopsie, that just was the easiest way to do things. And Britain just let them do it because that seemed to be the easiest way to do things, until there was this whole uprising in India and Britain kicked them out. It's like, all right, you guys go do actual business. We're going to take care of this. Um, so when they're in charge of something, there's very little you can do about it. They are massive. I mean, even after, I think the thing in India happened after um, the American Revolution, so this hasn't happened yet. But like, this was like a secondary country within the British Empire. They were huge. Um, so the protests within the colonies were, your typical protests, refusing to buy the tea. Some places even refused to sell it. So, like, if you had a merchant that was part of this boycott, and they got the tea in their shop, they would just put it in the back. Like, they wouldn't even put it on the shelves to sell. I mean, that's a pretty efficient boycott. It's like, don't even offer it to people to buy. There you go. It's not getting sold. This, of course, culminated in the famous Boston Tea Party. 50 men disguised themselves as natives. Not very well. I'll get that in a minute. And tossed 45 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. That I never actually think about whenever, it's like, oh yeah, Boston Tea Party, they threw a bunch of tea there. 45 tons. If you're not familiar with, tea, before you, like, boil it and have it as the thing that you drink, it's, like, ground up leaves. So it's not very heavy. So they dumped a lot into the harbor. It'd be like saying, oh, they dumped 45 tons of, like, dried leaves into the harbor. It's like, yeah, that's going to take most of the night. The disguising themselves as natives thing wasn't so much to be like, oh, a bunch of random natives came into the middle of Boston and got aboard this ship and destroyed tea for some reason. It was less that and more like when you wear a balaclava to rob a store. Like, they're not going to be like, some dude that was clearly going skiing broke into the store to rob us. Like, it was just to make it so you couldn't tell who the people were. Also, though, a lot of the people were too obvious to not be identified. But the people in Boston were like, we didn't see anything. Just a bunch of natives were running around throwing tea off the ship. They just so happen to have Bostonian accents, but I don't know. So this was another case of ain't nobody gonna snitch. So the British really didn't like this. They passed the Coercive Acts in 1774. The port of Boston was closed until the residents of the city had paid for the destroyed tea, which 45 tons of tea, that's not cheap. The Massachusetts court was moved back to England, and the colony's charter was revoked. Which, if you recall, from when the Puritans came over, that sort of stuff was like part of the founding. The Massachusetts court was brought to Boston from the start, and the charter was brought to Boston from the start. So the fact that, like, England removed both of those was pretty major. Also, they approved a new quartering act to station troops in colonial homes to ensure that they were behaving. Needless to say, the colonists were not too pleased with this. They called these coercive acts the Intolerable Acts because, well, we're getting very dramatic here in the colonies now. And started arming themselves to resist the British. Now, I should further mention that this was not a call to independence. Um, the idea of British colonists arming themselves to fight back against the British is pretty normal. um, I've got a friend in Australia who's like, oh yeah, well my grandfather was part of the such and such uh, something that happened, and I looked it up, and it was like a mine riot, and it is considered like one of the biggest um, like acts of defiance against the British, and anyway in Australia, like that was their big thing. I was like, for a country of like criminals, because that's what Australia started as, like y'all are kind of tame. we had mining riots like all through the 1800s and early 1900s because of how bad we were about like treating our workers. Like that's not even a blip compared to actually going to war over this. So yeah, but like I mean they did shoot at the British. I'm not saying that wasn't a thing, but like our miners shot at the government. That's just how we did things. So yeah, shooting at the British is just like a Tuesday. Uh, so the Continental Congress, this was representatives from various colonies met in Philadelphia in September of 1774 to kind of figure out what they were going to do about all this. Because obviously things were starting to spiral, and they needed to get out ahead of things before it got, well, too out of control. And on the one hand, they they were getting started before things got too crazy, but they didn't move fast enough. Everybody's here. Morning. So, yeah. First Continental Congress, 1774. Again, I'm not gonna. You guys aren't gonna need to worry about the dates. I'll let you know when there's an important date, but just kind of giving you a timeline here. Also, just to further remind you guys, we were talking about benign neglect before, where Britain wasn't really paying too much attention to the colonies because they had other stuff going on. This was the extent of the British Empire. They were busy elsewhere. They had... Where's my mouse? They weren't worried about what some weirdos were doing over here. They had all of Canada. Ireland was always causing trouble, and that was right there at home. They had all this stuff happening in Africa, which they were attempting to build like a railroad from Cairo to Cape Town. Also down here, there was a diamond rush happening. Actually, they were trying to take this from the Boers, who were Dutch colonists, and that was a whole thing. India's India, one of the most populous countries in the world, and Britain was dealing with that. Well, not Indonesia's up here. Just like all of this is a whole lot of other separate issues for Britain to deal with. Australia, need I say more? I don't think New Zealand was giving them too many issues. New Zealand's usually kind of chill. Yeah, so they had a lot of stuff going on. And some colonies over here whining about taxes were pretty low on their list. As I was telling my other class, like, I'd say we wouldn't even break top 3, maybe not even top 5, because India was probably all top 3 or top 5. So yeah, they had other stuff going on. Now, as I said, this did piss them off. Like, oh, you dare, the royalty. And then I just toss this in there too. Yeah, look at the tiny box of India tea. That's totally gonna add up to 45 tons. Anyway, so we've got some of the uh, contemporary responses to the Boston blockade. The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. This is another one of those, like, pouring boiling water down your throat. And this is another instance of, like, since Boston was basically blockaded off, it wasn't like they were being starved out, but they were pretty desperate on supplies. So occasionally you'd have people from other colonies sneaking in supplies for the Bostonians. I don't think it was quite as desperate as this. I mean, clearly they weren't the whole, like, cage in a tree thing is obviously symbolism. But, yeah, it was the whole thing. So, speaking of the Continental Congress, we have 56 delegates that met in Philadelphia's Carpenter Hall. Every colony had representatives there except for Georgia, because I guess Georgia was too busy that day. I don't know. Whatever's going on in Georgia. Most of them already knew each other, either from the Stamp Act or other petitions and protests, because they had already gotten together and were complaining about stuff from Britain. So it's not like this was the first time any of them were meeting. Still, though, despite the fact that they had worked together and were familiar with what was going on, a lot of them, well, most of them didn't necessarily agree on how to move forward with what was going on. Because things were happening pretty fast, and also there wasn't a great deal of communication. So, like, the stuff happening in Boston was constantly developing, and they didn't exactly have live reports from Boston. So it was very, very up in the air. So you had radicals, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Christopher Gadsden, who we will never speak of again. I think the book maybe mentions Gadsden offhand a few times, but we're not going to talk about him. Moderates like George Washington, John Dickinson, who was the Pennsylvania representative, and then more conservatives like John Jay from New York, because New York was about the closest to a loyalist stronghold as you could get. Now, that said, I think this is the same John Jay. We talk about John Jay a few more times in later chapters. He's like a delegate, or not a delegate, he's a I think he ends up on the Supreme Court, but he's also a foreign delegate for the U.S. So, like, he does a lot of stuff later. He's not, one of the big guys we talk about when it comes to the American Revolution, but he shows up later. So, good for him. So, despite the disagreements between these groups, there was still no major talk of independence. There was no, we gotta be our own country, because nobody wanted that. As I said before, Britain was the economy in the world. And our major gripe was we had a pretty good thing going for a while, and we just wanted to get back to that. A redress of grievances, basically Britain backing off on its taxes and whatnot that we felt were unfair, which, again, it was more that we hadn't been getting the same taxes as the rest of the empire for the last, 100 years. So when we suddenly got hit with all of them at the same time, we felt like we were being oppressed. But we wanted to go back to how things were, which, again, was mostly us being ignored and left to do our own devices. But you couldn't really do that in an empire. Still, though, this put the resistance of the coercive acts back into the hands of the elites, which is something that I would like to point out is pretty much how the whole American Revolution went. It was largely a product of the elites, because these taxes, these acts, these things that the British did that were so terrible, mostly were affecting the bottom lines of, like, the rich merchants and the elites. I mean, because, like, even George Washington, who, always had this humble air about him, he owned a really big plantation. Like, he had money. And he had money to lose if these taxes came over and were putting money on, or putting taxes on the things that he was buying and selling. So, one, the resistance is largely the elites, because, again, they've got money. But also, rather than relying on, like, Boston to handle itself, the colonies are now part of a group effort in their resistance against Britain, which is certainly good for cohesion, because, again, as I said, as we get into the actual revolution, that becomes an issue. So I've got this really nice picture here of Carpenter Hall. I had a student one year that was like, oh, hey, I've been there. Like, I lived, like, 2 blocks from that place. Like, oh, that's really interesting, because this is, of course, a major part of our history. And also, it's just really pretty. That is some really nice brickwork. As someone who grew up in a brick house, like proper brick, not, the fake brick you can just put up over plaster anymore. Yeah, this is a pretty building. And then they've got, the stuff inside, it's, just a little museum. I'm not into American history enough to actually dress up like that and do that every day. I would lose my mind. I'm not enough of an American historian. So we do here have the First Continental Congress, and then a quote by William Jennings Bryan, who, I hate to say it, isn't a very influential president. I think he was president no, 1908. What was he president? I don't know. He wasn't very. I can't even remember where he lay in the important presidents. I guess he was before McKinley, because then McKinley wasn't around very long, and it was, no, because I don't know, the years don't make sense. Anyway, his quote here: "A government conceived in freedom and purchased with blood can be preserved only by constant vigilance," which, good quote from somebody who, again, I can barely remember. I mostly remember him in the various political cartoons of the day of people making fun of him. Even back then, people didn't really care for him. So, at least he got a nice quote here. Actually, no, I don't think he ever became. I don't know if William Jennings Bryan ever became president. They just used his quote. Oh well. All right. That's actually it for Chapter 5. So, going back to the Sugar Act in 1764 up to the Continental Congress in 1774, there was a decade of reactions to parliamentary pressure. And as these various protests continued to build, they gradually became more organized. And while communication was still pretty primitive, relatively speaking, they did use what they had to organize from these squabbles into all these colonies working together into pretty organized resistance. Still, as I said, this wasn't a full united front. There were still issues with authority within the colonies. That's always going to be a thing. I mean, any conflict you ever see, there's always going to be people from either side that don't necessarily agree with whatever side they're, quote, automatically on. Still, though, as late as 1774, and even as we're getting towards the end of 1774, there's no major group pushing for independence. They just want to go back to how things were, where they're getting the benefit of the most powerful government in the world, the most powerful economy in the world, I should say. Well, I mean both. But none of the taxes. Which, you know, I mean, that's fair. But that's a hard line to balance, especially with Britain being Britain. All right, let's see what I can do about the next one. Where'd the mouse go? There it is. All right. So, chapter 6 is properly called Revolutions. Yes, plural, because the book likes to be smart about it. So 1775 to 1783, which is the length of the war, more or less. I mean, technically it ended before 83, but that's how long it took to get the peace treaty done, but don't worry about that. All right. So, in April of 1775, the British troops began making their way towards Lexington and Concord. This was due to rumors, and by rumors I mean this was true, that the colonists had stockpiles of weapons and ammo, well, supplies, I guess. Ammo would just be the balls, powder and whatnot, stashed in Lexington and Concord to use later to resist the British. So the British were like, well, let's just go in and destroy it now, and they won't be able to use it against us later. So that's why the British marched into Lexington and Concord. It's never really, at least I never remember it being talked about when I was in high school. It was just like, the British marched on Lexington and Concord. Because. Yeah, so they were doing it because the Americans were, or the colonists, the patriots, whatever you want to call them, were stockpiling weapons. However, Paul Revere had already made his way through to warn the militia, at least in Lexington. He had a group of other riders, including, if I remember right, a young woman who rode further ahead to also warn Concord. Because I think he got caught after Lexington. But because he was like this big to-do, fancy pants higher up in Boston, the British was like, hey, you can't be out here, and just like turned him around. So, yeah. Meanwhile, the local militia that he was warning were known as the Minutemen, because they claimed they could be prepared in less than a minute, which, considering how long it takes to load a muzzle-loading musket, it's clearly a bit of an exaggeration, but hey, good for them. So, The first shots of what we consider the revolution happened at Lexington. The Minutemen squared up, and the British showed that they were actually trained in military formations and beat the hell out of the militia and pushed the colonists back. If I recall correctly, let's see, yeah. After a brief exchange between the British soldiers and local militiamen, 8 colonists lay dead. British troops then moved on to Concord, where they uncovered and burned colonial supplies. So, not going so well for the colonists. However, rioters had already moved out to other local settlements and let them know what was going on. So we had now more than just the Lexington and Concord Minutemen who were aware of what was going on, and now more militia were moving in towards the British. So on the way back to Boston, the Minutemen were using harassing tactics, which is to say hiding behind trees and barns and whatnot, and shooting into the British formation. Now, in case you guys aren't aware of how the muskets worked back then, they were not rifled like today's modern rifles, hence the name. They were smoothbore, and they shot lead balls. They weren't aerodynamic at all. So the way I like to describe it is if I were to have one of these old muskets, it would weigh like 20 pounds. These things were heavy. And I were to shoot it at any one of you in this classroom, there would be an equal chance that it would hit you, the wall, the ceiling, or anyone else in this room because of how much it's just going to deviate once it comes out of the barrel. Because it's a ball, and it's just shooting around the barrel, and once it comes out, it's just going to go wherever it wants to. Which is why when you see movies or you go to a reenactment, they all stand in a line and politely shoot at each other. Because it's basically, they're making one big shotgun and hoping for the best. They're not just like standing in a line and all getting shot in the face by, a modern day rifle that's going to hit more or less where you shoot. It's a crap shot where it's going to hit. But if you're a dude in the woods and you're shooting at a line of guys in red jackets, you're probably going to hit something. But if those guys in red jackets are trying to shoot one dude behind a tree, you're probably going to be all right. So yeah, they gave the British absolute hell. Let's see, it says they killed 73 and wounded 200. So the British really took a beating on the way back to Boston. It says that the British were actually forced out of Boston. Outraged Bostonians attacked the British troops and forced them to retreat to ships in the harbor. Eventually the British troops regained control of Boston, but they entrenched themselves on hills just north of the city. And this is when Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys began making their way towards Fort Ticonderoga. So very, very quickly things began happening. And the Second Continental Congress was like, oh guys, we gotta do something. So this is happening technically the next month, but this was April 18th, so this was within a few weeks of all of this going down. So there was this push towards, well, we need to slow things down and try to negotiate with the British to stop things from going into full all-out war. Others are saying we're already at war because the British have been shooting our citizens, so we need to just go for independence. And then the Battle of Bunker Hill happened, also known as Breed's Hill, because Breed's Hill was also there. Bunker Hill was the larger of the two, and I think it lasted longest. It lasted the longest, but there were two. Anyway, um, so General Sir William Howe was the British commander in this battle. He's going to be the British general that we're going to see most of throughout this war. Um, and while the British were victorious in defeating the colonists, um, they lost twice as many troops. Here in the book, um, British forces under General Sir William Howe attacked fortifications on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, north of the city. The British won the day when Patriots ran out of ammunition. You know you're doing a pretty good defensive job when you just run out of ammo. But the British suffered more than 1,000 casualties, while only half that number of Patriots were killed or wounded. So yeah, the British got the crap kicked out of them again, while technically winning. And this emboldened the colonists to maintain their stance for independence, because if these actions, which were not especially well organized, bloodied the British's nose, then maybe an actual organized defense against the British could be successful. Because I mean, this was just some militia guys up on the hill that fortified it and stuck around until the British attacked them. And they really hurt the British. So if maybe they actually had, supplies and military tactics and reinforcements, they probably could have done significantly better. Also, before I bring up the next image, Paul Revere. We know him as the guy that rode around and yelled at people. And I did show you that image earlier of his engraving. But does anybody actually have any idea what his day job was? Like what he did to make money? Because he was like really high up in Boston society. I mean, anybody just want to thought a guess. That's fine too. I like to see just how close you guys can get with a guess sometimes. It didn't have anything to do with horse riding at all. That was just something that everybody could do, I guess. Wasn't shoemaker. It was a bit higher brow than that. It was like an artisanal job. He was a I guess if they still had guilds at that time, he'd definitely be in a guild. So you're on the right track. I want to throw another one out. Nobody? Nobody wants to just guess? Close. See? It's fine. You guys can just guess. You're not going to get in trouble. He was a silversmith. So, pretty close. Yeah, he made stuff out of silver. Um, which, I mean, honestly, shoemaker isn't that far off because, I mean, they were artisans. They made things for people to use. Um, So yeah, he made stuff out of silver, which, compared to like a blacksmith, um, wasn't necessarily something that everybody could afford, but he made bank. He made a lot of money doing this. So he was like actually one of the most wealthy people in Boston at the time, and also had pretty strong ties with the church, if I remember right. So he was like very influential in Boston. So the fact that he like chose to be one of the people doing the ride to warn Lexington and Concord is why he's remembered, because he's like really important and rich in Boston, and he totally could have had just other people do it for him. Um, and there were other people that were there, but he also was like in the middle of that. So, and the Minutemen, which of course I just had to include. Yeah, so there they are doing drills for proper stance and firing and whatnot. Make sure they don't accidentally shoot their buddy in the back of the head. That's not very efficient. And then Bunker Hill, which again it was just a hill with like a fortified top, but turns out shooting at guys at the top of a hill is a lot harder than shooting at guys back at the bottom of a hill, especially if you're trying to charge up said hill, and you've got guys shooting down at you. It's a whole thing. And then as you can see, we had guys ready for close range too. Which, to be fair, once they did run out of ammo and the British came charging in, these guns doubled as clubs. The butt of the muskets were very, very thick, very heavy, so you could just grab them by the long end and just like beat the crap out of people with the stock. So yeah, they kept fighting. All right. So, the Continental Congress saw from the Battle of Bunker Hill that, hey, we should probably have ourselves an organized army. That would be a great idea. If these guys on a hill can do that much damage to the British, then maybe an actual organized army would be a good idea. All right, this one shouldn't be wild guesses. Who's going to lead the Continental Army? Very good. Brigadier General George Washington is going to lead the Continental Army. As I said, he's got the experience from the 7 Years' War, and he also has a lot of connections with the higher ups anyway. So he had a lot of what was needed for the job. That said, though, he had a lot of issues from the start. The Continental Congress was not a national government. It could try to proclaim itself a national government, but that will probably cause like a mini civil war in the middle of this, and we didn't need that. So the Continental Congress didn't actually have any authority to call for a draft or like tax the colonies for war revenue or anything. So the only way for Washington to get troops or get supplies was to ask politely and hope that the local militias and the local colonies will give him men and supplies for this war that is happening. Yeah, he spent a lot of time just getting his soldiers to work together or to work at all. And this is the part where I say a thing that might get me sent to El Salvador. Washington wasn't a very good general. He, like, militarily, he wasn't very good at his job. Like, in terms of tactics and leading men in battle, not so great. What he was good at was keeping his men from deserting, to keeping his men from leaving after a battle was lost, or after a battle, even if they won, it didn't go very well, or just leaving because the winter's really bad and they're starving. What he was really good at was inspiring his men, which for a general is about half of what you need to be able to do. So he did that half really well. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he was this perfect general that could do everything, because he could not. But he was very good at the part that kept the men together. We had other generals who were better at like leading in battle, so we'll get to that in a little bit. But when it came to just getting the guys to the battlefield, Washington could do that. He was real good at that. So he had two major goals here at the start of the war: to push the British out of Boston and to secure the colonies from the British from the north, because the British held Canada, obviously. So in November of 1775, General Richard Montgomery captured Montreal. So again, another general that's leading troops into a victorious battle. However, he was meant to receive reinforcements from General Benedict Arnold, who, I know that name probably is familiar to you guys. Before the whole betrayal thing happened, he was, I don't know if I'd say our number 2 general, but he was right up there with Washington in terms of importance and like benefit to the cause, which is why his betrayal was such a big deal, because we lost a really important guy. Unfortunately, his reinforcements were decimated by cold and smallpox, and they were unable to reinforce General Montgomery, so we were not able to push the British out of Quebec. So we don't have Quebec as a state. So while the early battles of the winter of 1775 and 1776 were kind of at a standstill, like taking Montreal, but then basically being pushed to a stalemate, that's not something you want in a war right away. You want to keep that momentum. We did have a major victory, and that was when General Henry Knox delivered the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, that fort that I told you guys Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys had gone to capture earlier in the year. Well, they had done so. They had gone up, they had captured the fort from the British, and they were holding it when General Knox came rolling in, and they're like, hey, what you want to do with these cannons? And he said, well, I'm going to deliver them to Washington, actually. And so he did. He brought them down to Washington's troops. Washington set them up around Dorchester Heights, which, if any of us were from Boston, we'd be like, oh yeah, I know where that is. But I've only been to Boston once, and it was while I was driving on the road to bring someone to the airport, and it was a nightmare. So I don't know where Dorchester Heights are. I just know that I never want to go to Boston again. Or at least drive in Boston again, I should say. I'd go, just don't make me drive. So he positioned these 43 cannons around Dorchester Heights and beat the crap out of the British and forced them out of Boston. I've got a lovely map to show just how this worked. And again, if you guys show up for my 104 class, which is the second half of like European history, this same tactic gets used on the British by Napoleon in a battle before Napoleon starts doing his whole like empire thing. He sets up cannons up on hills and starts just shelling the crap out of the British while they're down in a port. And you can't do much about it because you can't aim cannons up very well, especially not cannons on ships. So here is Montgomery dying dramatically because while we may currently be fighting for our independence from Britain, we were still very much British, and we still very much liked our war martyrs. So there we go. Here is Washington and General Prescott. They've got bringing the cannons to these various hills around Boston, and they've just got the city surrounded, and they just start shelling the city from all sides. And General Howe could do very little but leave. And when you're getting hit from all sides by cannons up on hills, so you can't really shoot back, the only thing you can do is get on your ships and leave. And while the book doesn't mention this, apparently we had like pirates that were working with us that attacked their ships as they were on the way out. Now, granted, attacking British ships is a good way to get murdered, so I don't think the pirates did too great of a job, but it still gave the British a hard time. So, yeah, that was a heck of a thing. All right, let's get a little further along. Yeah, we should be able to get these last two done, and then we'll be as far along as my Tuesday Thursday class is. It'll be great. All right. So, we had what was called Dunmore's Proclamation in Virginia. He was the governor of Virginia, but also like he was the royal appointed Virginia governor, so he was still the British guy. Because while the colonies are fighting against the British, not everybody's fighting against the British, and a lot of these royal colonies are still being run by British officials. So Dunmore's proclamation was that any slaves that were willing to fight for the British would be given freedom, which really caused issues for the Patriot leadership, because while they were all about freedom, they were obviously very selective in who they wanted to give freedom to, which is to say only them. They didn't want to disrupt the plantation economy or the social hierarchy in the, currently still colonies. Yeah, so that was an issue. Now, there were colonists that wanted to negotiate a settlement with the British because they didn't really want to have a war. In fact, there were a lot. I had a percentage in another one of my sets of notes. It was like a third wanted independence, a third were loyalists and fought for the British, and another third just didn't want to fight at all. So, like, again, it wasn't this full, everybody's on board, rah, America versus Britain. It wasn't a popular revolution, really. However, King and Parliament prohibited any negotiation or trade with the colonies, so those that were trying to be neutral often were pushed to work with the rebellion because you were kind of out of luck either way. Now, I will talk more about the Loyalists as we go forward, I think. I'm pretty sure the book... Yeah, we're going to talk about the Loyalists as we go forward. Now, there's this very important bit of documentation here. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, 1776. It was a little pamphlet that used arguments from biblical sources and scientific analogies to push the arguments for independence. Now, that's all well and good, but the reason it was so important is that it took all these big and honestly complex arguments and ideas and concerns and broke them down into things that the common man could understand and argue and um, relate to. Because, as I said, this was mostly like the colonial elites' war for the first part of it. So within the first 3 months, it had sold 120,000 copies, which back then was insane. Um, they would debate within taverns and coffee houses, which is where regular folks met. This wasn't just a thing in, the Continental Congress. This was being used to convince regular folks that independence was a good idea. Within weeks, George Washington wrote to a friend about the, quote, sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning contained in Common Sense. And this isn't a typo, this was just how it was spelled back then, because, English wasn't really standardized back at the time. Yeah. So as Common Sense especially helped to move this from a mostly elites looking out for their money independence movement to a people wanting their own country, their own freedom across the colonies movement. So colonies started taking control of their legislatures, pushing for independence. They also sent an agent to France to request an economic and military alliance because we were pretty sure we couldn't beat Britain on our own. Because, I showed you guys that map. The British Empire is huge. Now, while their military is certainly spread all around the world to keep all these places safe, we are but a fly compared to the British Empire at this time, and we could use some help. And as the eternal saying goes, if you don't like the British, the French like you. So, hey, we're fighting against the British, maybe the French will join in. So here's the front page of Common Sense, or as the full title is, Common Sense Addressed to the Inhabitants of America, written by an Englishman, January 10th, 1776. And there's, Thomas Paine. So yeah, he was British. He was an Englishman. He wasn't American, or he wasn't in the colonies. All right. So, between armed conflict spreading across the colonies, Common Sense being very popular and pushing legislatures all across the colonies to push for independence, and also just being hard to argue even within the Continental Congress. Many moderate delegates at the Continental Congress started to also push for independence by June of 1776. So, of course, Thomas Jefferson led the charge in preparing the Declaration. Now, I don't know what you may have been taught in high school. I remember how I was taught, where basically Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence out of essentially thin air, that it was divine inspiration. No. He built on ideas that had already been expressed by folks like Thomas Paine, John Adams, I forget which Lee that is, George Mason, language common in local declarations, town meetings, county officials, colonial assemblies, etc. So, for example, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was drafted by Mason in May of 1776, all men are born equally free and independent and have a certain inherent natural right. And John Locke, who, if I remember right, was from like 100 years before, he was part of the Enlightenment, he expressed social contract theory, which is where sovereignty is within the people, which is to say, let me read this one from the book. He argued that sovereignty resided in the people, who submitted voluntarily to laws and authorities in exchange for protection of their life, liberty, and property. The people could therefore reconstitute or overthrow a government that abused its powers. This is all stuff that had been argued before. So the Declaration of Independence was not some new radical idea that was just pulled out of the ether by Jefferson's genius brain. He took these ideas that were floating around and made them like basically a single page, which to be fair is pretty good. that takes brain power to summarize all these lofty ideas and stuff into something clean and concise. Now, granted, when he did bring this to the Continental Congress, they debated and revised it like a million times. So, like, the version we have now is not the version he started with. There were a couple things they had to agree on. They stated that the king had, quote, excited domestic insurrections among us, which is to say the Dunmore's threat of freeing slaves, because we couldn't have that. Because, again, America ran on slavery, and you can't have that being threatened to get taken away. July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies approved the Declaration. New York abstained, because, as I said, New York was really full of loyalists. And they just chose to sit out the vote. So they formally declared independence on July 4th. The Declaration was published as a broadside, circulated throughout the colonies, which was technically treason because we were now declaring ourselves independent from Britain. Even though we were already like fighting Britain, the war had already been technically going on. But the actual declaring independence was the treason bit. And I'm still of the idea that like our Independence Day should be when the treaty was signed, as opposed to like this thing, because this was just a piece of paper that said, "Hey, by the way, we're currently at war, but we're now making it official." Like, big freaking deal. We've been fighting for like a year now. Yeah. So there's the guys discussing the Declaration. Do I have anything else? No, just that. Okay. Yeah, that'll actually do it. We got 5 minutes. I'm not going to get into this other stuff because it goes on for a couple of slides. So, yeah, Wednesday we'll just continue. I don't have anything else to say. We'll just keep going with War of Chapter 6.